We are following on 2 amazing rounds, and we are breathing still. I had the great benefit of all of your wisdom as I sort of reconfigured our questions for today. And so this last one for the morning is first coming from Kathleen, and it has a follow-up from Willa. So again, it's big, and you can speak to it as you find is yours to say at this time. So much has already been lost. So much suffering is built into the planetary changes already in process. Global prospects of making the great turning are dismal to none. Yet going forward, continuing to try, is necessary. Why? How? And from Willa, what is required to sustain this work for the long haul? I'll start.
Why is simple for me, because we have no choice. What other choice do we have but to engage this with everything we can bring to it? How we've been talking about throughout these 2 days in many ways. And the 2 words that came to my mind were niches and networks. Niches and networks. So we talked about the refugia, we talked about the places where some of what the beauty of humanity is, with all its ugliness as well, but the beauty, some of that profound beauty can be sustained for whatever is to come next. That book Sarah called to our attention by Scranton about the learning to die in the Anthropocene, right? You had this sense of the monasteries during the Dark Ages trying to preserve something of the beauty. And niches. But then we have networks. We have this is the new thing we have. We have the internet. We have complexity. We have these new understandings of complex systems. E.O. Wilson, we connected on E.O. Wilson, this idea that we've evolved not only as individuals, but there is also a level of evolution that has to do with the communities, the communities that have the properties that enable them to self-correct and sustain, that have algorithms, bee colonies, ant colonies, E.O. Wilson's particular special species. And there are ways in which we can learn from those networks. And maybe this step across this threshold to this new level of consciousness involves some new creative synthesis of the niches and the networks in ways that some people are trying. Some of the systems dynamics people that Beth works with at MIT, Otto Scharmer and Peter Senge and others, they're really experimenting with that, with what it might look like, with whether there's some new way forward. That's one of the places I'm watching.
So Kathy says, global prospects for the great turning. Not really very good. Why is it necessary? How is it necessary for us to continue in every way possible? It's my own experience of this is letting it in, letting it in, letting it in, feeling heavy, and then feeling grateful for what I can do. And there really is a deep inner necessity in that. Kind of an inner flow of doing everything we can, not just doing, being. As we know is ethical, as we know is loving, feeling it, living it fully. It's like a kind of incredible opportunity to put so much aside. And to do what's real and loving. So it's good how necessary it is. How just it comes, I think, for us when we're present to what's happening. It just comes. And why wouldn't we, whatever happens, why wouldn't we want to have been as fully humanly dignified and ethical and loving as we could possibly be, all the way? And sustaining that, silence, community, deep reckoning with each other, being real with each other, small, close, living, tending, paying attention.
I don't think I think about the prospects very much or try to assess them. I think if I did try to assess them, I'd probably agree. It's hard to see now how it's going to happen in time. But I'm not so sure it's like one big turning that either happens or doesn't happen. It feels more and more to me like little rivulets, and some will turn and some won't turn, and the more the turn, the better. And when some turn, they make the channel deeper. It makes it easier for other rivulets to turn. I guess that's a little bit of the how in my mind, is turn whatever rivulets you can turn by whatever means you seem to have. The why, I mean, part of the why actually is in the first part of Kathy's question. So much has already been lost and so much is already lost, but still here. What other way to honor that than to not give up on the rest? Like, accepting there are things I can't change, it seems like the next best alternative is to at least say, I'm going to try to learn, I'm going to try to help other people learn from that loss. I think another part of the how that I'm trying to learn more about is another one of those examples where we've created all these universals actually based on the biology and physiology of men. So until this year, I didn't know that there's, in addition to fight, flight, and freeze, there's another response to stress in the human being, which this psychologist who discovered it called it tend and befriend.
Yeah.
And her evolutionary explanation for it, and so it was only discovered, so it's mediated by a different set of hormones, and it was only discovered by looking at women's physiology instead of men's. And what she said was, under a dangerous situation, if you've got an infant and a toddler, your options to flee might be limited. You just can't get out of there. If you fight, you might leave those babies orphaned. Freezing doesn't seem like a good idea. So if you have a bunch of women with small children, what they need to do is band together and take care of each other. And I think that's where we are. Like, it's clearly there's no flee. It's clear there's no fight, because who do we fight except ourselves? Freezing, that's, so to realize that there's this other thing left. So that, I think, is a big part of the how, and for me it's also a part of this Willa's question about how do we sustain the long focused attention, because this goes beyond my generation, and I think it's right there in tend and befriend is how we sustain it in comradeship and in care.
I think we are learning. Whether we will learn and teach enough, quickly enough, we can't know. But we were talking before about the number of people that are trying to develop technologies of conversation that will allow people to think in groups, which is what we're trying to do here. And we're not going to walk out of here saying, okay, we've got it. We'll just announce it to the world and everything will be great. But we're each going to walk out of here with some new skills, I think, from simply having shared this experience over several years, and new relationships. Not all of us are going to keep in touch with each other person, but I bet there are a number of ongoing things, and that they will branch out in new ways. So I think one of the things we can do, actually, is become much more conscious of the issue of what is community. How is it that people are capable of cooperation? Not just do they. Quite clearly, they do more cooperating than our culture tells us they do. And we're just barely catching on to that and noticing it, which is insane. But we are evolving a number, I'm going to say developing, I'm not talking about genetics. We are developing new ways of organizing and interacting. And most of them have a downside as well as an upside. We have to learn to manage them. But things are happening. In all this despair and fear at what lies ahead for the planet, don't you see things happening? I mean, feed your hope. Take what we know about the plasticity of human beings, about how we have again and again adapted to changing conditions, how we have invented new ways of organizing and communicating. You know, we got to do it fast, but actually there's a whole history of trying to figure this stuff out, as well as the history of destructiveness and rivalry and conflict. So it really is worth working on. And there's pretty good evidence that a small group of thoughtful, right? I mean, here we are. And we're female. So don't anybody despair, please.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. You know, like the rest of us, I'm really conflicted about this. This ties in with all of our visions of the future and what we think will happen, and then how to avert it in some way. And several of you have said, you know, we need to try everything. We need to bring everything into it and see what works. And I totally agree with that. I think we need to also be aware that there are others trying everything they can, sometimes ways that we don't think will have great outcomes, and some way things that we do. And so it's almost like trying to be the signal that rises above the noise about what to do. So we're a tiny signal right now, and how to become a bigger signal. And to sort of continue with the organic theme and how to make these things work organically, I'm thinking, you know, if we really are compassionate about the planet and beyond our lifetimes, we need to think about beyond the Great Turning. Yes, invoke the Great Turning, but make sure that what invokes it is something that keeps us on that path and sustains us on that path, because I could see ways to have the Great Turning which are not appealing to the best parts of our human nature, like wars and extreme conflict. So how to plant so many seeds in places that are receptive to it. And then immediately I go back to, we are pretty elite. We are a small group of people in the room, and I think myself, my first response to thinking how to do something like this is like in my local community, but thinking globally in this way is what's so daunting for me, because it needs to happen globally. It needs to happen in communities of small fishing villages in Indonesia. The thought process needs to happen in places where, you know, people want to have this sort of natural selection of ideas happen at that Great Turning. This is the big filter too. It's not just a turning, it's a filter for what we need to sustain us. And how do we make sure that those genes are spread around enough, not in a biological sense, but metaphorically, spread around enough, these ideas, so that it's a big enough part of the population to be selected. To me, we talk about communication, but we're still talking about societies that are created the problem that we're turning to. But I think we need it beyond that. And Otherwise, those people won't survive either. So the ethical part comes in here as well. How do we make these decisions? Are we deciding to save the planet or civilization or what? Or humans? If we were truly altruistic, we would just save the planet, right? But if of course, we're not going to, do harm to our own species. So how do we do this in an ethical way, in a humanocentric way, but also on the sort of the planetary scale? And I'm torn. I don't know how to do this. I love this process, and I want it to grow organically, but how do we do it in beyond our elitist, my elitist mind? That's what I find myself trapped in.
Yeah, I don't know, Joni, that's why I asked the question. I know. So why is it necessary? Well, let me just say that what you just said reminded me of, I think it's Aldo Leopold, and I'll get this wrong, but what he said, something like, ethics don't just pop up. An ethic develops in the mind of a thinking community, which raises the stakes for us, little thinking community. Yeah, so why is it necessary to continue? I think the answer to that is pretty straightforward, and the answer then would be love. That we love what is at stake, and we won't let it fray and fall apart. And it's easy to think of love as a kind of la-di-da, skip it through the tulips kind of thing, but love is a sacred trust. And it's this ferocious determination to save or serve the interests of the object of your love. So I think that's the easy question. How, I think, is harder. And I've been thinking about it a lot, and in terms of moral courage, I think that it's going to take a character trait, along with a set of strategies and tactics and principles. It's going to take a character trait. And when I think about moral courage, what I think about is an insurrection, to use your word, an insurrection against utilitarianism. An absolute refusal to go along with the notion that the value of an act lies in its outcomes, its deliverables, that we would measure our own the moral worth of what we do by how much good we're able to produce. That's a very small little corner of ethics, and somehow we in America think it's the only way to think about, the only way to measure the worth of our acts. But there is this other field of virtue ethics that our acts are right if they embody these virtues. And so I like to think about moral courage, which is not the same as fearlessness. Remember Sandra Steinbrecher, somebody said to her, how do you ever get the courage to do what you do? I would be so afraid. She says, I'm always afraid. Courage is doing it even though you are afraid. So that's, I think, what we have to summon is the courage, which is maybe just stubbornness, but is the courage to do what we think is right, even if we can't save the planet. We do what's right because we think it's right. And the courage to, in every way we can, defend what we love, even if it breaks our hearts. So those are the only kind of thoughts that I have on the subject. But I like the premise of the question, which is the premise being that it is necessary to go on. That's not the issue. It's necessary.
I think the why for me is because I am fully aware that I am made of the material of this place, that I am an earthling, that this is my place in space. There is no place like it. And then I feel like I have to channel my grandfather, because it's something he told all of his grandkids before he died. He sat us down and he said, I don't want to cry when I do this. He said, you are billions of years in the making, and you carry the wisdom of your ancestors within you. You can access that at any time, He said, "You are born of this time, for this time, and there is no one like you. And you must do what you were put here to do, uniquely. And your job is to figure out what that is." He said, "You have survived genocide, slavery, and disease. And yet here you are. If that's not a why and a how, I don't know. Does it make it any easier? I don't despair. I know that life always finds a way. It may not be our Homo sapiens sapien that continues, and I'm honestly, I'm okay with that. I'm okay because I understand the long tail of time and geology, and knowing that all things lead to their end. And when you know that things are finite, then you start to appreciate them. Then you start to say, well, what are we doing while we are here? I tell my friends, no minute on this planet is guaranteed. You have no guarantee that you can say, I'll be there next year or even next week. So what are you going to do in this moment with who you are and what you have? How will you serve? Because we all live in service to each other, whether we acknowledge that or not. A king, an emperor, a politician lives in service to constituents. We like the illusion that we are in competition, that we are individual, that we are somehow isolated and separate, but it's an illusion. It's not true. And so how do you remind people gently that we serve each other? And that's where joy is, in service. How shall I serve is what I ask every morning when I wake up. How shall I serve? How does that manifest?
I think everyone here so far got to say at least once, I love this question, this one's mine. I love this question. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I finally have an opportunity to write about it. And with your permission, I'm going to steal from every one of you. It's really hard to add to the amazing things you have said. But I'll try to say a couple of things that sort of come to my mind. So one of the things that I think is important is not just that we think about what do we do, but also what do we stop doing. And the reason I think that's really important is there's a thousand things we do right this day, in our current life that will make it that much harder to stick through it and be with it and make cooperation possible in the future. In the communication field in which, I often encounter this, the number one thing I keep trying to stem the tide against is our war metaphors and our labeling of others as enemy. All the ways in which we constantly, Bill McKibben, bless his heart for all he does, but he has no trouble whatsoever of, labeling people, pointing fingers. And I know this is part of what advocates do and the whole fighting metaphor for going about that, but when push comes to shove and you have to work with that industry or with whatever later, how do you do that after you just call them the worst names in the universe? It's so much harder. So it's just one example in which I think we should think really hard about, the words and the deeds that have long impact because they make it so much harder later. So, that's one one way, I think, to think about it. I agree with many of what you have said about, it cannot be outcome driven, and I maybe want to just put one little modification on that, and that is outcome dependent. Because so much more will be lost, and so much more will go, and the disappointment that we just set ourselves up for is, it doesn't mean we shouldn't love, whatever, all these things, but I think if we make our working toward something good dependent on saving it, then that's just depression hell, as far as I can see. I want to play a little bit with the great turning and the little rivulets that you put forward. There is another metaphor that comes out of shipping, I suppose, that we can think about, and that is, if you want to turn a really, 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 really big tanker, you don't do this with, just one steering wheel. You do it with trim tabs. In other words, there are little things that, create little turbulences that make the turning of the big wheel a lot easier. So can we metaphorically think about what are our leverage points, our trim tabs to help turn in all the little places where we are? Just turn that one over, turn that one, that makes it easier for something else to turn. Education, I think, is one of the major trim tabs we have, because it sets so much else in motion. And I think the last thing I want to say is that I believe that if we do not think of the time we're in as the penultimate human transformative story, if there isn't a notion of a transition to something else, if it only goes to ending, who are you going to get out of bed tomorrow? It's very hard to mobilize. But if there is always a bit of a framing of this is a transition to something else, whether or not we get there, it's totally unguaranteed. But framing it as a transition, as, in the more I think about it as an initiatory story for the human species, the more we can explain what happens and the tasks that we have and the difficulty we have in the process. Because anybody who has gone through a quest or major transformative process knows that this isn't for the faint of heart, and it's not, you're going to be anything from bored to, exposed, hungry, lonely, at major risk of death in all ways that we can think of. So I think it's really important we tell a story that is a positive, I guess I don't want to call it a motivational story because it sounds like, cheap motivational talk or something. I'm talking about tapping into the deepest desires of the human. Something that will sustain us through the hungry time. And I think that comes from if the whole transformative process is about becoming the Homo sapiens we we could become. So the story we tell, I think, is crucial.
Everyone has put so beautifully the why and the how, but what came to me initially was the answer to the why is that the answer to that question comes to me when I'm in the outdoors, when I even look into the eyes of a cardinal in my backyard, when I look into the eyes of my dogs. My dogs are nonviolent beings. crazy, but but they don't drive and they don't fly, and they, they're pretty sustainable animals. And when I look into the eyes of children, there's why. Like Kathy said, love. How could we not? How could we not? How could we not? And what is required to sustain? What comes to me is wisdom, especially the wisdom to listen deeply to the truth, to hold that truth with grace, or those truths with grace. And then, secondly, compassion. But not the kind of compassion that I think in our culture we often think of. When we think of compassion, we think of softness and yielding and wishy-washy, but not that kind of compassion, but fierce compassion. A compassion that is interested and draws near to suffering with curiosity and with love and with empathy, as wanting to be near suffering as a doorway into a deeper love. An unwillingness to turn away. Compassion is that unwillingness to turn one's back on any being. There's an archetype that we find in the Buddhist tradition called a bodhisattva. And the bodhisattva is, that word is sometimes translated as the loving warrior. So sometimes these images of fierceness come with the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is unwilling to turn our back on any one being. A willingness to fight for their welfare, to be the protector of beings, protector of living creatures, of sentient beings, is the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva, the one who serves. So when I hear in Camille's waking up every morning, how can I serve? That is the vow of this compassionate archetype, of the archetype of fierce compassion. The mantra is, how can I serve? How can I serve? And third, doing the inner work. Doing the inner work. And I think of that as just returning home and remembering who we are, who we truly are as the inner work, coming home to that truth that we are wild and free, that we are awake. And if we're awake, we must carry out that ethic of the bodhisattva, of the being a creature in interdependence and acting on behalf of the planet. That is our calling. If that's not our calling, why are we here?
In my unenviable role as timekeeper, we're at a point where we wish we had another round. I do, and we should actually draw this to a close for the morning. But I think we should go around and just say any 2 or 3 words that you want to say as we close the circle, so that we feel that we're giving it the care that it should have as a process. So I'm going to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm
I'm really sensing out of the circle that we want or we should try to have a round about what does it look like after this transition. I mean, Susie named it, but it keeps coming up in the circle. I think we see it, we need to be emboldened to say it. So I don't know if it's now or when we meet again sometime.
I want to give you a metaphor to think about. A lot of people talk about the planet as our mother, Mother Earth. Try thinking of the planet as our child. A lot of good reasons for that. One is children are vulnerable. Children are the future, the unknown future. And when we were small, we pretty much counted on our mothers to look after themselves. So think of the planet as at the beginning of life, not at the end of life. As think of everything we do as promoting not only life, but growth and development and promise. I don't mean economic development, by the way, but and let us look at our home not as something that usually takes care of us, but something that we take care of.
If not to serve, why are we here?
Just want to echo the gratitude.
Our child, our beloved child.